Great. So thank you very much for the introduction, and to the organisers as well for inviting me to talk about my research in the Pagan Tibet Project. So as Françoise mentioned, the project is an ERC-funded project that's based at the EPRC. And in terms of the core question of the project is around what is the nature of Tibet's pagan religion. And so for us to do this, the project is undertaking a systematic study of a range of manuscript collections. Some of these are old or established collections that we are aware of, and some are more recently discovered. And the locations of some of these have been plotted quite roughly on the map that you can see on the screen. In terms of the size of the collection, we have around about 100,000 manuscript pages, although this tends to increase every time someone on the project does any field work. So the number will likely go up the next time I present as well. Some of these texts have already, or these collections have already been published in manuscript facsimile, but many haven't. And as it stands, we don't have a catalogue or an index for these texts. So we really need to go through the entire collections in order for us to begin to piece together these pagan features that the project's interested in. I don't have time to talk about the project in more detail today, but for anyone who's interested, I'd recommend that you go to our newly launched website, PaganTibet.com. And I've also added a link to a YouTube recording of a presentation that Charles Ramble and Marika Milan gave 2 years ago that talks about the project, the scope and our aims in a lot more detail. But just to quickly touch on some of the challenges that we have in working through this collection. So of course, the size of it in itself is huge. And even with the whole project working on this, to manually go through all of these texts would take more time than we have. On top of that, many of these texts haven't been looked at and we don't have existing transcriptions. So we're applying digital humanities to essentially open up these texts so that we can begin to search and work on these. But even there's problems for us to navigate as well. So the first is the quality of the texts, but also the images that we have. So they vary in how blurry they are, and also the angles that the images have been taken on. I have a few examples that I'll show a little later on. These texts also are made up of a variety of different scripts and handwriting styles. They have diagrams, tables, and things like this are really difficult to capture digitally. But the content as well is challenging for us. So the texts are made up of a range of different kungyang, or abbreviations and contractions. They use non-Tibetan symbols and graphemes. And some of the texts also use a different numeral system to the standard Tibetan numerals that we're used to. And I've just put a couple of examples on the screen to show the variations that we're working and dealing with as well. So as I said, we have developed what we're calling a computer-assisted workflow that's made up of 3 key steps. So the first is transcribing our entire corpus. And to begin with, we're creating diplomatic transcriptions. So this is replicating as closely as we can what we're reading in the manuscripts. And we want to preserve as much of the linguistic features as possible. So this is a crucial first step for us. Once we've done this, we'll then normalize. So this is creating more standardized transcriptions, opening up abbreviations, simplifying some of the punctuation that we've captured, correcting some spelling and so on. And then once we have both the diplomatic and normalized e-texts, we can then begin annotation. So this is labeling and capturing Tibetan pagan features, which we're interested in. At the moment, we are currently wrapping up what we call phase 1 of the project. So this is producing the diplomatic and normalized e-texts. So this is what I'll be focusing on in this presentation. But I also just wanted to draw attention to the fact that we work with audio-visual sources as well as textual sources. I don't have time to do both today. So what I've done instead is added a QR code to this slide. So if anyone is interested, you can scan this and it will take you to slides that Marika created for a presentation a few weeks ago that talks about some of the automatic speech recognition, so creating models to transcribe recordings. It's there in more detail. So for the rest of the presentation, I'm going to talk through essentially our workflow for handwritten text recognition, for transcribing text diplomatically, and then what we've been working on for normalization. I'm also going to bring in a few considerations and questions that we've asked as we've been navigating this workflow, in part to give a glimpse into the state of the field more generally, but also I thought this might be interesting to anyone else who is planning on using digital humanities tools or approaches in their own work. So at the outset of the project, before we even thought about how we'd apply handwritten text recognition, we really needed to think about the workflow and what this would look like, who would be involved, and how we would allocate our time and resources as well. So we had 12 months to develop the models that we needed for handwritten text recognition, which is quite a tight time frame. And so that in some ways shaped the decisions that we made when developing our workflow. And one thing that we really reflected on was, could we do all of this in-house? So did we have the knowledge, the expertise within the project itself to do the whole pipeline by itself? Or would it be better for us to collaborate with others and draw on expertise outside the project as well? And one way of potentially doing this would be crowdsourcing, which has become quite popular and is a bit of a buzzword at the moment within digital humanities. So this is using volunteers to generate training material. And although this can be really lucrative and work really well for some projects, it wouldn't have worked partly because of our time frame. So onboarding and training volunteers takes more time than we had, but also the nature of our text is very specialized. So to find a group of volunteers who would have the knowledge and be willing to volunteer their time felt like a bit of a shot in the dark. So we decided we would collaborate instead with others. And then something else that we needed to do was also survey the tools that were already available, and whether or not these would be sufficient by themselves or would require some tweaking or starting completely from scratch. So to do this, we took a small sample of texts. So this would have been October 2023, so a couple of years back. And at the time, there were really only two models that existed for transcribing Tibetan Ume. And both of these had been developed by the TibScroll project, which is based in Vienna, which I was part of before I joined Pagan Tibet. And they'd made these publicly available on Transcribus. So we decided to test these to see whether we could essentially build on these or whether we would need to come up with something completely different. And hopefully you can see this somewhat clearly. There are two steps to applying HDR to texts. So the first thing that you need to do is run a model that marks out the layout. So it's the green box that you can see around the text itself. And then it also marks out the lines, so it's underlined in blue. And this tells the second model, the transcription model, where to read for text and where to ignore and where to focus. So you can hopefully see that the layout model was okay, but the lines didn't always stretch to capture the whole folio. So in the example in the top left, it missed out the yigo. And it sometimes wouldn't join lines either. So if there was a sufficient gap between sections, it would treat these as separate lines, which we wanted to avoid. So this signaled to us that we needed to at least build on top of this layout model, if not develop something completely from scratch. In the same way for the transcriptions, it worked fine. It gave us usable transcriptions, but they were in no way perfect or close to what we needed. So we could identify some key areas to work on. And crucially for us, these transcriptions are produced in Wiley, and we wanted transcriptions that were produced in Unicode, because we're planning on using natural language processing or NLP techniques further along in the project. And it's really better if you have Tibetan Unicode instead of Wiley. So again, that signaled to us that we would need to come up with our own models that would transcribe into Unicode. So this was a useful starting point for us. So with that in mind, we came up with a collaborative workflow. So it's us with a green in this workflow, the internal Pagan Tibet team, and then we have 3 key partners. So the first are the BDRC, who are acting as a central repository for our transcriptions and our images. We then have Azukia, who are an NGO that work on Tibetan language teaching and tech solutions. And they've been instrumental in helping us design tools that we're using on the project, some of which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then a core part of our digital humanities work so far has really been down to the work of our annotators. So this is a group of 10 monks that are based in Triton Norbutse Institute in Kathmandu, who have done everything from manually transcribing materials for us, correcting, and they've also been part of normalisation. So they've done a huge amount of work for us so far. And again, I'll talk a bit more about this as we progress. So once we'd developed a workflow, we could then start thinking about the images that we have. So often before you apply any handwritten text recognition or any kind of digital tools, it's worth looking at the quality of the images to decide whether or not they need any processing beforehand. So some of the things that you might need to do is rotate documents, split them if you have multiple pages in an image. And quite often there's a process called binarization. So it's turning images into black and white, which is easier for AI models to read. So these were all things that we needed to consider and play with to see if it enhanced the results that we would get from existing HTR tools. So again, we took a small sample of texts and we did some tests just to get a feel for what pre-processing might be needed. And we were very fortunate actually that most of our images had a decent resolution. So we look at what's called dots per inch, DPI. And anything over 300 is generally considered sufficient. So it meant that we didn't need to play with the resolution of our images too much. For the handful that we did need to do something with, there was a code that I'd developed as part of the TibScroll project, and that was sufficient. We could apply that and it would improve the resolution and also run what we call denoise. So it takes out some of the stains and grainy resolution of images. If anyone's interested in any of these scripts that were developed by TibScroll, there's a link on the slide that you can follow, and there's a set of instructions alongside links to all the different tools that were developed. A few other tests that we did was to check whether if we, so many of our images have 2 pages per image, and we wanted to check if this impacted the quality of the transcriptions. So whether it was better to give transcribers 1 page at a time to read. But we found that actually that didn't make a difference. So it meant that we haven't had to spend a lot of time splitting and cropping our images so far. If and when we decide to do this, we'll likely use a code that was developed by BDRC called SCAM, Segment and Crop Anything model, which will work to crop our images for us. But for now, we've been able to leave them as they are. And then some of the other things that we'd considered, such as binarization and playing with deskewing, so trying to straighten images. We realized we didn't need to do this before we uploaded the images to Transcribus, because Transcribus actually has inbuilt features that will do this automatically for us. And so that saves a huge amount of time and has meant that we haven't really needed to have a detailed pre-processing step. We've been able to almost jump this and go straight into transcribing the images. I just wanted to point out that there are plenty of pre-processing tools available if anyone is interested. Some of them do require some familiarity with coding or command line prompts, but not all of them. So for anyone who's maybe not so comfortable with coding, I'd recommend Scantailor, which is a software that you can download and essentially allows you to manipulate and play with images in one place. So once we'd decided that we didn't need to go through a huge amount of pre-processing, we could then focus on the transcriptions themselves. So we needed to come up with a set of conventions or a scheme to capture as much as possible for our diplomatic transcriptions. So this meant going through some of the text, identifying features that may not have a Unicode equivalent, and then coming up with how we'd best capture these different symbols and graphemes. And we also needed to develop a workflow that was ongoing because we didn't know what was in the text. So the more that we transcribed, the more features that we would likely come across and need to decide how we'd capture these. So we also needed to make sure that what we had was very much a living document that was regularly updated. So with that in mind, we've put together 2 documents. The first is our input and correction manual. So this is a sort of one-stop shop for everything to do with our HTR process. So it's not just our conventions, but it's also who's working in this part of the project, the tools that we're using, certain decisions we've made, and so forth. So it's quite a hefty document. Because of this, we decided it would be better for us to also have a thinner document. So we created a cheat sheet that has our 10 core rules and protocols for diplomatic transcriptions. And as I said, these were both living documents. So up until we wrapped up our HTR, we'd been regularly adding to these to capture as much as possible. And we've recently made these publicly available. So if you follow the link on the screen, you can access both of these. So once we'd developed the transcription system, we could actually begin to transcribe the texts. But what we needed first was a tool to enable this. So you can transcribe automatically into Transcribus. It's set up so that you see images and there's a blank text box. But what we wanted on top of this was some way of checking these transcriptions. So we have quite a rigorous checking process. The transcriptions go through 3 rounds of checks. And we wanted a tool that would enable this seamlessly without having to go through a version history, which was what we'd need to do with Transcribus. So with this in mind, Azukia created a custom tool for us called the Pecha HDR tool. And it's a very simple tool, so it's not particularly fancy, but that was perfect. That was exactly what we wanted, was something that was easy to navigate and also bilingual. So at its core, essentially, it's made to show a Tibetan picture, and then it has a blank text box underneath so that the annotators can manually transcribe straight into this text box. And then we have a submit and reject button. So the first round of annotators will type what they see, submit this, and it's then passed along to a team leader. The team leader does a check, and they can use the inbuilt highlight feature to flag any errors or mistakes in the transcriptions, and they can then return that to the original annotator, not just for correcting, but also to raise awareness of the mistake they made, so that hopefully they don't repeat that. If the team leader then accepts the transcriptions and approves them, it goes to the internal Pagan Tibet team. So one of the team members will then do a final round of checks before it's finalised. And all of this happens in one interface, which is really, really handy. This interface also comes with an inbuilt dictionary that has a lot of our transcribing conventions. So it's a spreadsheet essentially that you can scroll through. And again, this was useful for the transcribers to be able to refer to if there was something they were unsure of how to capture. So I should say that when it comes to our annotators, as I said, there's 10 of them. Half of them were working on this manual transcription, so transcribing whole pages from scratch. And then the other 5 were working on correcting transcriptions. So they were using exactly the same tool, but instead of seeing a full picture, they were seeing line by line and correcting these. And the reason that we chose line by line is that we wanted the transcribers or those who were doing the corrections to focus on exactly what they'd been given and not to be influenced or swayed by the context around that line. And this seems to have worked really well, so we were happy with this. The transcriptions themselves that they were correcting were produced by the TIBSCOL model that I showed at the beginning. So we applied this to a certain number of batches. We then took the Wiley transcription and we converted this into Unicode and uploaded it to the interface. So we had both manual transcriptions being created and then automatic transcriptions being corrected to speed up the process that we would create training data. So again, I've just put the workflow back here, just hopefully to help orientate yourselves with the idea of transcriptions moving up from annotators to team leaders, and then to the internal HTR team. And once these transcriptions had been finalised by the Pagan Tibet team, we could then start thinking about how we would use these for training. So we had already decided that we would train a model from scratch instead of building on the existing TIBSCOL model, because we decided that actually if you try to combine Unicode with Wiley transliteration, that will likely confuse the model instead of being a help. So we decided we would do it model training in iterations of 500 pages. So this is 500 pages of triple checked transcriptions at a time. We would feed this into Transcribus and look at the results. We had to decide whether or not we would create separate models for each script or hand, which we had done with the TIBSCOL project. So we had a Drutzer and a Betzug model, or whether we'd create what Transcribus calls supermodels. So this is a model that does everything. And we were inclined to go with the latter, just because it's easier to have one model that you can apply to a whole corpus without having to go through and look at the different scripts or hands. So that's the approach that we've taken, is we're creating one model that should theoretically be able to read any handwritten ume. And then one other thing that we wanted to think a bit more about is how to measure accuracy. So when it comes to handwritten text recognition, the usual accuracy level is measured with what we call character error rate, or CER. So this is the percentage of errors that you get or your model makes when it's transcribing. And generally anything under 10% is considered very usable. But beyond that, we wanted to look at applying this to real world or to unseen text, does that give us a better insight than just the character error rate? And the reason for this is, if you look at the example on the screen, this is an output that we got that highlighted some of the errors that the model made. So this increased the character error rate of one of our models. And in the top example, the model had added a sec when there wasn't one after a yigo. And so this skewed the character error rate because it is an error. But in terms of how we're using and plan on using these transcriptions, that doesn't really make a huge difference to us. So it's not worth us investing lots of time trying to reduce the character error rate if these are the types of errors that the model is making. So we were doing systematic checks with our models as well to get a better idea of how it actually performed on our texts. So if you went to Transcribus today and looked at the layout recognition models first, you would see that there are currently 3 available. The bottom one is the Tibetan Pecha model that I've already mentioned, which was developed by Tibscol. And then the top model, Tibetan Manuscript 3, was our most recent layout model. And you can see that the error rate is 5.43%, so it's already lower than the Tibetan Pecha model. So that suggested to us that this model was actually already better for our texts, but we wanted to test this by running it on some of our more challenging images. So we selected images that were blurry or had some staining or bleeding from the opposite side. And these are some of the images that I mentioned were taken on slightly strange angles. We wanted to see how they'd perform. And overall, the results are really strong. So even when we've got, as with the bottom left image, a pile of pages stacked on top of each other, the model is still able to recognize just the top page and ignore everything else that's underneath, which is exactly what we wanted. It's not perfect. So you can see in the bottom right example, there is part of the end of a line that it's missed. But this is an extreme case, so the angle of the image is quite extreme, but also these errors are few and far between. And it's not, in terms of trying to correct this, it would require so much more data that at this point the results wouldn't really be worth it. So we've decided that this model is actually robust enough by itself to be applied to all of our texts. And then when it comes to the transcription models, there's quite a few more now that are available on Transcribus. I can't go through all of these, but I just wanted to highlight 3 in particular. So again, the bottom model was developed by Tibscol. And then Pagan Tibet Ume 1 and 2 were the first 2 models that we trained, that we made publicly available last month. And you can see that the character error rate, so the error rate between our first and second model, has already dropped about 1% or 1.5%, with just the addition of 500 pages of training data. But both of these error rates are still significantly higher than the Tibscol model. So we wanted to test this to see if character error rate was really indicative of the model's performance, or whether we were actually on the right track with our models, and to continue the work that we were doing. So we took a selection of images that hadn't been transcribed, and we decided to apply the Tibscol model and then the 2 Pagan Tibet models, and compare the transcriptions, looking specifically at the error rate on a page level. And I know you can't read the transcriptions because they're very small, but hopefully you can see the red that tells you how many errors there were on this particular page. So the Tibscol model, although generally it has a lower character error rate, when it was applied to our texts, it was often hitting an error rate of about 50 to 60%, which is incredibly high for what we need. Whereas Pagan Tibet Ume 1 and 2, we saw significant reductions in the errors that were being produced. So this told us that actually choosing and fine-tuning a model to your own texts had a huge payoff, even if it required a lot more work. We also, around the time that we'd developed our second model, BDRC launched their OCR app. So we also wanted to test this as well to see if that was a viable option. But as you can see, the error rate was about the same as the TibScroll model. So it really isn't applicable for what we need from our transcription models. And this is just a chart again to show you across the selection of pages that we chose, just how the models performed. And it's really clear that our second Ume model outperformed all the others, which is exactly what we hoped for. And if anyone's interested, Marika and I co-wrote an article that came out a couple of weeks ago, which if you follow this link, would take you to that, and it goes into the comparison in a little more detail. And just to say that we haven't stopped, so the first two models we have made publicly available, but we've still been training in increments of 500. So Pagan Tibet Ume 3, we trained over the summer with 1,500 pages, and Pagan Tibet Ume 4 is our most recent, that was trained on 2,000 pages. And you can see, at least with Pagan Tibet Ume 4, the character error rate has dropped again, which is exactly what we were hoping for. But more importantly, when we've actually looked at the how this is performing, it's by far our best model yet, which is brilliant. So we have the data to train one final model, which will hopefully wrap up at the end of this month. With 2,500 pages, and that will be our final model. So we'll then have something that we can apply to the rest of the collections. There are other HTR and OCR options, so not to say that our models are the only ones that are worth exploring. So I've already mentioned BDRC's OCR app. So this is a software that you can download, and it comes with 5 inbuilt models, and it's definitely worth testing these because it's free and open access. And then the other one, for anyone who's working with modern typeset editions, Dharmamitra has an OCR app that works really well. Unfortunately, it is really just for typeset editions and doesn't work very well on woodblock. And again, just to point out that on Transcribus there are lots of models. We have 2, and we'll be making the other 3 publicly available in the next few months. And the best thing to do if you're interested in using these is to actually go and look at the descriptions for each of these models. They'll tell you a little bit more about the training data, and they'll give a sample of some of the images that have been used. So you get a sense of whether it's a good match for your texts as well. There's also an option to do a quick text recognition, so you can upload a sample of your images and run the model, and that will give you an idea as well of the types of results to expect when you apply each of these. So that's our HTR. So we've essentially wrapped up this part of the project, and now we're moving on to normalisation. Well, we started this, and we're now moving on to it in a more serious way. So with normalisation, some of the things that we needed to think about is actually what are we normalising, and how realistic are our expectations. So for example, expanding lots of abbreviations, some will be easier than others depending on how much data we have, whereas correcting all of the spelling mistakes that's in our texts would be almost impossible to do without spending a huge amount of time really going through this. In the same way, we also needed to look at what tools and scripts were already available, and could they be adapted to what we needed. And we're very fortunate that there are actually a few normalization scripts that are already available. Two of note are a code developed by Divergent Discourses. This is quite a simple tool, so it expands, I think, around 6,000 abbreviations. It standardizes some punctuation, but it's a useful starting point. Better suited to what we're looking for is actually a script that was developed called Actib. And this works on converting Old Tibetan into a more standardized form of classical Tibetan. So it has more rules that align with what we want. But this is still relatively simple in terms of what we're hoping to get out of our normalization script. So we can take this as a starting point, but we really need to develop something far more comprehensive. And so to do this, we needed another tool that Azuki have created for us, our normalization tool. And essentially, it's set up exactly the same way as our HTR tool. But this time, the annotators get the image and the diplomatic transcription that was created. And what they do is they go through this and they normalize as much as they can. So we've given them a set of punctuation that we want them to standardize, certain ways of capturing numerals, expanding abbreviations, and so forth. And it works in the same way. So we have the same highlight function because we've checked these normalizations. And this time we have an abbreviation dictionary. So this has around 10,000 abbreviations and expansions that the annotators can refer to if they're not sure on how to expand something. And one particular feature that we were very happy with in this tool was that this dictionary fed into the transcriptions as well. So if the tool recognized that something was an abbreviation, it would pop a blue line underneath, and annotators could click on this and it would open up and give them the suggested expansion. It worked better on some of the more simple cases, but what this meant was that it could speed up the process of normalization because the annotators could go through and just accept anything they agreed with or ignore it if they didn't. So what we're doing with the normalization is essentially we're extracting all of this data and then we've created what we call a div check. So it's similar to a plagiarism checker where essentially you put in the diplomatic and the normalized texts and it highlights where the changes are by putting them in brackets. So these are some simple examples just to give you an idea of what it does. But with this data, we can start to put together rules for our script. So of course these are quite simple, but all of it's important in fine-tuning the script to what we need it to do. So this is an ongoing process. We're still doing some normalizing at the moment, but the idea is when we hit a certain target, we'll have enough to be able to finish the script. Another aspect is to finalize or double check all of our abbreviations. So to do this, Azuki have created a dictionary checking tool for us. So it works with the div checker. Essentially, it takes all of the diplomatic text that we have that's highlighted, and then in the box underneath, it gives what the normalized version was the first time it was input or expanded. And essentially, the annotators need to go through each of these examples and either say that they agree with these expansions, or if they click that they don't agree, they'll have another pop-up box where they input what they think the correct expansion is. So we're doing an extra round of checks on the abbreviations because this is really key for what we're doing. There's so many of them in the text that we want to try and get this as correct as possible so we don't lose the meaning in our normalized transcriptions. So this is also currently being worked on, and we're hoping to wrap this up in the next month or so. So once we have this data, we'll be able to extract from the normalization tool and dictionary tool to update and finalize our normalization script. And once this is ready, we can apply it to all of our diplomatic e-texts, and we've then reached the end of phase one, where we have two e-texts for all of our texts. And this means then we can move on to our annotation and analysis. So as I said at the beginning, annotation is where we identify and mark up particular features that we're interested in, and we can provide then labeled examples, so we can train models to recognize this over our entire corpus. So this is what we'll be migrating to at the beginning of next year when we start phase 2. And I just have a couple of minutes left, so I just wanted to kind of show you what we can do with annotated data, because it might seem a bit abstract when I talk about just labeling. So Marika and I have published, and it's forthcoming, a study. So it's based on a small pilot where a series of texts were taken. These were a mixture of known pagan texts, also Buddhist and Bön texts, and these were transcribed, normalized, and some of them were manually labeled as Buddhist, Bön, or pagan to start as a reference point. We then used a tool that's called fast text to convert the words in the text themselves into a numerical number. It's called text embedding, or word vector. Essentially what it does is it plots texts or words, and the words that are closer together when they're plotted should theoretically be more similar in meaning. And what we wanted to do by doing this is essentially assign texts to broad categories. So based on semantic textual similarity, so looking at the similarity of texts, could we group them into roughly Buddhist, Bön and pagan texts, and what would that look like? And in this pilot study, we tested this, and as you can see, it's not the nicest of pictures, but you can see that that's exactly what happened. So we get these 3 very distinct categories, with Bön somewhere in between the pagan and Buddhist texts. And this was useful for us because some of the newer texts that were recently discovered, which we've labeled Leyu Baima, by doing this test, we could see that they actually had a lot of similarity with our known pagan texts. So those, for example, that come from Dunhuang. So this was really useful for us just to get an idea of what's possible, and that STS works as well for classifying texts when you're working with a large corpora. And if anyone is interested in knowing a little more about this, as I said, Marika and I have a paper that's coming out hopefully in the next month or so. So just to wrap up, this has of course been a very quick overview of the workflow. There's a lot more that takes place, but just to give you an outline of the sorts of things that we're doing and have been doing with the Pagan Tibet Project. And for us, computer-assisted workflow really is vital in order for us to navigate and work with such a large and complex set of data. But just to say, because I know there's a lot of fear around digital humanities and AI, that in no way are the machines taking over. At every step of the way, we need human input, and it's really crucial for evaluating the stuff that we're doing, making key decisions, deciding when to stop, and so forth. And that now that phase 1 is coming to an end with our diplomatic and normalized e-texts, these are crucial for, of course, opening up the text so that other members of the team can start to use these and search for key things. But really, once we start annotating these texts, it will open it up even more so that we can begin to analyze and piece together the nature of Tibet's pagan religions. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much. I will just, on the last slide, for anyone who's interested, because I know I've thrown around quite a few links, you can scan the QR code or follow the link, and this will take you to a set of the slides that I've uploaded online, if anyone's interested.